Thank you so much, Ellen, and the directors of Cardno, especially to Mr. Andrew Berkeley. And I'd like to take this opportunity now to congratulate Michael Renshaw for his new appointment. I thank Cardno for inviting me to speak at this world-class Resources and International Development Conference. It's a timely conference and relevant because of its implications for the welfare of communities in developing countries that are resource-rich but do not have the various capacities to exploit fully this natural gift for the benefit of citizens, be they natural or man-made. I'm not an expert of fundi in mining or development issues, but I can speak personally about Zimbabwe, my beloved country, a country so wealthy in natural mineral resources whose diamonds have unfortunately been termed a curse, as President Morgan Tsvangirai of the MDC described in his end-of-year address, which provides an excellent example of how not to manage the natural resource-based industry. And I picked the diamond industry specifically because we in Zimbabwe could actually be the '1 diamond producing country in the world. As I speak in terms of what has been found, if it was done properly, we are probably sitting on $1 trillion worth of diamonds if it was mined properly. But we live in abject poverty. As the heading of my paper suggests, it takes two to tango. My heading being a Zimbabwean experience, an excellent example on how not to manage the natural resource industry. It takes two to tango because there's a lot of stakeholders and players involved in making this happen. And if we consider the recent lifting of sanctions on Zimbabwe, especially, again, because of that, by the EU, that now diamonds are being sold at Antwerp. Yet there are a lot of issues which we should be asking, but why is that? And it's questions as well which business needs to ask, especially when they're doing business in politically charged environments, that do they have a responsibility, although they might be doing social responsibility, and they give themselves that responsibility, but what is the other responsibility when it comes to politically charged environments? Because you will tend to be painted by the same brush when you look at that. Let me at first declare that I believe that business's main objective is to make a profit for the shareholder. In the same breath, I hasten to add that business must act responsibly as a good corporate citizen. But how broad does that go? I take this opportunity to acknowledge the excellent work carried out by organizations such as Cardno, the Australia African Mining Industry Group, represented here by Jeff Hart, I think. The Australian government, it used to be called AusAid, now I think it's called Australia Government, and other such organizations, as well as these kinds of platforms like the conference, that seek always to address sustainable development for communities through mining. I want at this particular moment, if I can, honor a Zimbabwean gentleman called Farai Mugau, who was the first Zimbabwean to bring to international attention the horrific abuses committed by Zimbabwe's security forces in the Marange diamond fields in 2008. He was arrested for nearly a year, and his work resulted in the intervention of the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme in 2009. I think you are all aware, you must be aware of that if you are in the industry. Just a bit of background on the diamonds. Zimbabwe is a small country located in southern Africa, I think you all know it, but it's actually a disgrace that it is rated as amongst the poorest countries in the world in GDP per capita terms, yet has the highest net ratio of natural resources to population of any country in the world. Potentially, therefore, it's a wealthy country. We have a quarter of all the world's chrome and platinum reserves, the largest untapped iron ore deposit in the world, substantial gold resources, as well as some 30 other minerals of global significance. Until 10 years ago, the only diamond discovery was a small pipe on the Limpopo River on the south of the country. In 2000, again, these are the stakeholders, the company called De Beers, which I think you are familiar with, found the diamonds in the Marange district. For reasons best known to themselves, they didn't do anything with them. And 6 years later, the of exploration, they abandoned the discovery. It was then taken over by a London-listed resources company, ACR Limited. ACR found gem-quality stones in 6 weeks after De Beers had been there for quite a long time, and published a notice to this effect in the British press. Immediately, the Zimbabwean authorities stepped in and cancelled their exploration permits and took over the claims. That's the ACR. The initial action taken by the state was to allow some 40,000 small-scale miners to exploit the alluvial diamonds that were located in the sands on some 80,000 hectares of otherwise arid bush. Geological records indicate that the bulk of the diamonds in the Marange-Chiadza district are located in a belt of hard agglomerate, and based on limited drilling, indicated at least 9 billion carats of rough diamonds in the structure. At today's market value, this would be worth at least $1 trillion. And this does not include a new area which diamonds have been found. And so hence in 2008, just before the election of the 2008, which brought the inclusive government into play, the government realized the value of these deposits and sent in the army, with the result that 200 local diamond peddlers were killed and drove the rest from the diamond fields. 6 companies were then allowed to take over the mining of diamonds at Marange, involving the complex and unclear structures owned by the then Ministry of Mines, and the security services in China. Since then, some 10 million carats of diamonds have been extracted, and the largest of which is Engine, a company which is owned by the Army and the Chinese Army. There's been no transparency in this operation, and little or no reliable information on either production or sales is known. However, what little intelligence there is available, it would point out that between 2006 and 2013, over $12 billion of minerals have been extracted. In a country where the national debt is about the same value and the national budget is worth $4 billion a year, which is equivalent, by the way, to a quarterly net profit results of one Australian bank. Such a volume of production and the subsequent value of sales and potential yields to the exchequer is very significant. But nothing has ever been received by the Treasury. During the inclusive government, the then finance minister wailed and wailed that there was no money coming from the diamonds, and some of and ZANU-PF would say there is, and today they are the ones who are screaming that there's no money which has come from the diamonds. And so the tiny fraction of the diamond sales revenue accruing at Marange has been paid to the Zimbabwean government in tax and royalties, which we talked about. Over an aggregate of 5 years, less than 300 million, which is has been of the total estimated sales has gone to taxes, which is absolutely criminal. Much of the remaining resources from the diamond industry have gone into the pockets of international criminal elements. And I'm not afraid to mention the companies because it's documented in Israel, Belgium, India, Hong Kong, other African countries, and China. And it's very surprising that now that Belgium and the EU want to have lifted the sale of diamonds to the world, but yet they've not lifted the exports of beef to the EU from Zimbabwe and such things. So what this does not tell you is the story of the misery and deprivation that remains behind in my beloved country. When maternal and child mortality is among the highest in the world, life expectancy is among the lowest in Africa, the average spend on education is $20 per month per child, and on health, $40 per month per person. Totally inadequate numbers to give them a decent life. Yet we are sitting, not that we're sitting on these diamonds, but they are being extracted and taken away. In all of this, it must be noted that international pressure and the Kimberley process has been almost totally ineffectual. Added to this story, the story of corruption and arms dealings in other countries and in Africa, it is not difficult to understand why my country remains a basket case, unable to feed or clothe herself and completely unable to lift her people out of poverty, even though we have natural resources to do so in abundance. That is just an introduction. You will be asking questions, but in terms of who those role players are, it's fine that we could be going into all these lovely ideas and all these things are happening through the mining companies, but how far do you go to play in such an environment? But you only go so much but there's other issues involved. Thank you.
Thanks, John. You're doing my job for you, for me. That is precisely the point. I just wanted to emphasise one point that you made there, Jacqueline, and that is that this week now, today, those diamonds are being sold in Belgium, so that there's the second tranche of sales after the EU lifted the sanctions. So I guess that makes the point. How far do you go when you're the company, when the EU has sanctioned the trade in what they know is, they must know is an inappropriate trade in these diamonds?
I think there's, I remember a long time ago, before my time, where business was a very strong influencer, politically, especially in Africa. If you remember apartheid, who drove that aspect of apartheid in South Africa? It was business, at the end of the day, with the international community. Yes, it's all very well that we are doing what we can do in terms of social responsibility, etc. But I think that voice from business needs to be identified, to come out very strongly to help change situations. And I don't know where that voice has gone. And in Africa, it was very strong in Zimbabwe. That's how we got the sanctions. But now business is nowhere. It's just a matter of just extracting.
But in this case, the business, the biggest business you're talking about is a partnership between the Zimbabwean government and the Chinese government. So, this is why it's number 157 of 175 on the index that we're about to talk to Transparency International about. So it's hardly a mainstream voice.
Yes, I'd like to yes, I hear what you're saying, but the relationship between the Chinese and the Zimbabwean security forces in that sector is not a people relationship. One of the things which we have a problem with is it's a political relationship. And I think I raised that issue about political relationships, and which goes back into the time we fought the war, and they make a relationship with the leaders rather than the people in the government, and that is the issue. Yet we do have miners, proper mines in Zimbabwe. There's Rio Tinto, there's what is it, Zimplats, who do things according to the book, and thank you very much. And during the inclusive government, mining was indicated as the driver of the economic sector, and it contributed in the past 4 years 45%, I think, of the entire our GDP, which grew at 9% when we were in government, which grew 9% per annum. And that was because they were doing things correctly. But diamonds, which as I've given you the figures, do not contribute point iota to the business. And so this is why I'm saying that I believe that government has a role with the international community, or some form, to make some form of platform with the international community to write issues which are like ours in Zimbabwe.
I want to thank you. I want to come to you, Ian. What's BHP Billiton's approach when they're in a circumstance where it is expected that corruption is how we do business here, and if you want to do business here, this is how we do business?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And Jacqueline's case study of Zimbabwe is clearly an extreme case, a very tragic case. But corruption, as we all know, has the potential to be prevalent, perhaps in a less blatant way, in many of the countries in which the mining industry and petroleum industry and resources generally operate. So it is a risk that we face. And often we hear, well, if you want to operate in this country, you've got to pay, you've got to make minor payments to government officials to get things done. If you don't do that, you can't do business. Our view is that corruption at any level has the potential to impede development. It has the potential to have the sorts of impacts that Jacqueline mentioned in terms of reducing the potential for development and improvement in quality of life. And so our view is essentially zero tolerance.
It also has the potential to land your executives in jail.
That's right. So there's a moral argument, fundamentally the wrong thing to do. Then it's also often illegal in many of the countries where it is prevalent anyway. plus companies like ours that are listed on the US Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, we're all bound by extraterritorial legislation, which makes it illegal for us to make any corrupt payments anywhere in the world. And if our employees do that, they are personally exposed. So there are not many things you can do in a company like ours that can be worse than just being fired, basically. But if you make corrupt payments, the company cannot protect you. You're fully exposed to the full force of the law. They can take your house, all your assets, and lock you in jail, and we can do nothing about it.
Okay, and so if we come back to where we began this day with Oxfam saying you've got to flex your muscles, presumably you don't just pack up and go home and go, wow, too hard, don't want to go to jail, like my house a lot. What do you do? How can a company as big as yours create a new operating environment?
Yeah, look, I think the most important thing firstly is to understand the risks, fully understand the corruption pathways, how things can occur, then put really strong systems and compliance programs in place, ensure that all your employees are trained according to the nature of their work, so they understand the risks, they understand their obligations, and they understand the consequences should they choose not to follow it. And then you also need to have a really good whistleblowing framework as well, so that people can raise concerns about what might be happening in their part of the world. And then also you have to have extremely good books and records to ensure that everything is documented appropriately. Now, there is one exception that's probably worth mentioning in the context of this conference, and that's what we call health and safety payments. So if you're travelling and you're effectively held up by government officials saying if you don't make this payment to cross this border, we're going to have to give you a vaccination with this dirty needle or something, then you can make a payment, record it appropriately, and generally that will be considered acceptable. But apart from that, that's about the only context in which BHP Billiton will accept a payment in that nature.
I keep coming back to this image I have because I love a cliche of a bottle of Chivas Regal and two nicely cut glasses coming into a meeting with somebody important, and do I imagine that therefore BHP Billiton says we're just not going to operate in this way, and if you don't do something about those people down at the port demanding a facilitation payment, or those people over there demanding a facilitation payment, we will leave, and we are big enough that you will believe us. Is that the market power that you have?
Yeah, look, I think companies with a large international brand probably have a little bit more leverage in that sort of way than perhaps smaller companies that can just be ignored. So for us, most of the projects we're involved in are multi-billion-dollar projects. They have a high profile, they're very important to the government and the government's reputation internationally as being a good place to do business. So if our projects get held up, we probably do have a bit more leverage to go at higher levels in government and say, you need to sort the wharf out, this project's being held up, you're not going to get your taxes and royalties on time because we're being frustrated by this process. But I think the key for any company is to ensure that their values are absolutely clear, well communicated, everybody understands them, and you stick to them rigorously right from the start.
Because we understand that that's not how that company operates.
That's right.
They come through customs.
Yeah.
Okay, and now forgive me because I'm a journalist and I should believe in absolutes. I should be the last of the Enlightenment warriors. But how far can transparency really go? I mean, that's Transparency International, that's what you call yourself. How far can the role of transparency go from the company side in eliminating corrupt environments?
I think that the role of Transparency International since its beginning has been to shine a light on the challenge and problem of corruption and the kinds of stories that we've heard from Jacqueline and Ian's reflection of that in terms of the risks that are there and the very real way in which corruption undermines the pathway to genuine development, inclusive, sustainable development in so many countries that are resource rich. And the thing that what TI has tried to do in the first instance is to have people talking about corruption. When TI first started 20 years ago, the word wasn't mentioned. In fact, Jim Wolfenson, who became president of the World Bank in 1995, told me soon after he was appointed that when he was appointed, he was told, don't mention the C word. But today we are talking about it. We're focused in so many conferences around the world, and TI being able to raise that awareness through the kinds of tools that we've developed, including the Corruption Perceptions Index and other indices that we've also produced, focusing on the sectors in which corruption is likely to occur, and another, the Bribe Payers Index, who pays the bribes and in what sectors do they pay.
And do you find that there is a willingness at board level to open the door and shine the light in and to find out stuff maybe you don't want to know about just little facilitation payments, just little ones?
And as we've heard, there are legal sanctions against that in certain places. In the case of Australia, which
but first you have to find out. So does the company want to find out? In all instances, we're not talking about the level of corruption that Jacqueline's just exposed. They're talking about that.
Yeah. I think the extent to which we can see that will vary. We rely on how companies report against the standards that Ian has talked about. TI also produces annually a transparency and anti-corruption program reporting, analysing the top 125 companies to see to what extent they are declaring what kind of internal anti-corruption programs they have, the structure of the company, the beneficial ownership of particular assets in particular places, and a project-by-project reporting of what they pay to governments across the world. So, and I have to say that in the last couple of reports, the three most transparent companies in the world have been Statoil in Norway, BHP, Billiton, and Rio Tinto. So the big ones are there, reporting and so on. The smaller ones are not so transparent in what they do. But what we try to do as well is to work with companies to support the development of internal programs of corruption prevention. So TI has produced a business principle for countering bribery, which provides a template in which companies can introduce programs of the kind that Ian's described in BHP Billiton. The other area that we've been working on, of course, is through the multi-stakeholder initiatives like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which brings companies, governments and civil society together to help shine a light on what companies are paying to governments, what governments are receiving. That is a focus on revenue transparency. In the light of the discussions today, and increasingly we're recognising, even in the EITI standards, we need to go beyond simply the focus on revenue to all the stages in the value chain in mining, from the transparency about the allocations of licences, contract transparency in terms of infrastructure development, and a focus beyond the revenue side to also the budget side, how governments are spending the money, to enable citizens to hold people to account. The other thing that we need to do is to ensure that the laws are being enforced, and we track regularly just the extent to which countries who are signatories to the UK Bribery Act are actually enforcing the laws that they've introduced.
David, if I can come to you, the other piece of this discussion is about generating revenue, and to what extent is a kind of a way to immunise against corruption, to build the expectations of the community as to what they can expect from a mining project? Or is that just way too naive a comment, given what Jacqueline's just said?
No, that's reasonable. I think the answer to that is yes. I think that if you're working with communities, if communities are in a situation where they know what the companies are doing, with transparency, I think there's going to be less likely for corruption to occur. The one thing that was missed out perhaps in corruption, it's interesting to listen to the framework that you put in place for corruption. It's very similar to the framework that a company like Cardno has put in place.
Say it again.
It's very similar to the framework that Cardno puts in place to avoid corruption. And there's the one bit that's missing from what's mentioned before, is a lot of the corruption, if it occurs, doesn't occur at that level. It occurs at the companies and suppliers and all the various interlocutors who might be working for you. And I think in the past, a lot of people have used sort of plausible deniability. They've said, well, that wasn't us, that was our supplier. And it's very interesting that the UK anti-bribery law, which was passed a couple of years ago, is, I think, regarded as the most stringent in the world. And that makes it an offence to actually know about bribery and do nothing. And I think that's quite a step going forward.
And so talk to me about the examples that you've had in East Africa in terms of raising those expectations and the work that you were doing with the Development Bank.
Obviously the title of this session was not just about corruption. There was also, generating revenue and avoiding conflict. So I might prepare just a couple of quick examples on those other two sections to mention. Firstly, in terms of avoiding conflict, just some case study of work that Cardno does. We work quite a lot in East Africa with a variety of oil and gas companies. I won't mention the companies, I won't mention the countries for the moment. But I think the general feature of the countries we're doing this work in, these are actually new industries for these countries. Oil and gas is quite new. There is tremendously high expectations from the local people and from the local and national government. I think it's a very interesting comment. I think it was Bruce made this morning from Rio Tinto. He said when you get 20 miles outside the capital, what the national government have agreed to is irrelevant, and we find that very much. The expectation of the local governments is very, very high indeed. And the time span, the time scale of what people think is going to happen is also very... we do a lot of work where I think people understand the longitudinal surveys. We were going through on the first, looking through to see what there might be. And it's interesting, a lot of communities think that when you're doing that, you've already found something. And I understand that, 5% maybe actually find something in that case. And sort of, I distilled a few sort of best practice points that we found from this work. The first one is engaging with local communities requires very intensive early sensitisation. The guys should be involved at a very early stage in a very practical way. You need to have early monitoring of concerns and grievances and make sure that you have realistic expectations about how they will be dealt with. It's very important that you provide local staff in a local area and speak local languages. It sounds obvious, but it's often forgotten. And you're often working in a sector where it's odd actually, a very, very strong NGO and advocacy organisations, and often almost working, they're raising expectations with communities about what they may or may not get, sometimes unreasonably. I think that needs to be sort of challenged as well.
So managing those expectations.
Yeah. If I may briefly just mention one other, this is on the other part of it, which I think was generating revenue. We've been working on an African Development Bank project called the Inclusive Industries Programme. This is working in a number of sectors, including mining and oil and gas, but also agribusiness. It's working in Ethiopia, South Africa, Nigeria, Gabon, Mozambique and Liberia. And it's quite a new idea for Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank. They've got us involved much earlier in the process of giving loans to these businesses. And actually they're at the stage where they may or may not give loans still. And what they're trying to do as part of their mission statement as a development bank is to engage very early with potential beneficiaries from that project. So what they're trying to do is how do we, if it's an oil or it's gas, or it's mining or agribusiness, how do we actually make sure that when that comes in, it maximises the benefit with the community? We talk about upstream and downstream linkages. How are we going to make sure that the services that are provided to that company are provided as much as possible by the local communities rather than shipped in, which is often the case, It's an early project, it's a pilot project, and we're still fairly early in what we're finding. But what we're finding so far is that establishing a sort of organisational structure that involves all stakeholders in a social compact from the early days of the project can be very important. Very important is making sure local government is on board, getting support. Often people think because they've got national government support, they've got local government support and understanding. As I mentioned before, that's not always the case. facilitating acceleration of infrastructure programs in collaboration with local government, that's very important as well. Facilitating sort of business support services, how do you help these businesses, things like microcredit, training, various things like that. And I think this is something we hope that African Development Bank and other development banks might take further.
Thank you for that. I wanted to come back to you, if I can, Ian, around that question of, and it could cut both ways, to what extent expectations in a community and building a set of reasonable expectations, not about facilitation payments or, you know, a swimming pool in your backyard because you're the person, you're the guy, can help to mitigate against corruption at the national level or at a higher level.
Sure, but just before I do answer that question, I'd just like to answer your earlier question about do companies want to know if corruption is occurring? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. So the days where a mining company could send a business development manager out to some country, relatively corrupt place and say, get that deal done, just don't tell me how you did it, I don't want to know, just get it done, absolutely gone, because for one very good reason, and that is that the penalties under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US include a clause or a component which is called disgorgement. So you can make literally $100 illegal payment, corrupt payment to a government official, and then all of the profits that you make from that successful business that results from that can be disgorged at some point in the future. And that's why you see these massive fines, $600 million, etc. They're disgorgement of profits that were deemed to be illegally made because of corrupt payments.
And is this under international law, or is this because you're bound by UK law?
Well, we're bound by UK and US, but the bottom line is if you identify these things yourself, self-report them, deal with them, record them appropriately, the consequences are a hell of a lot better than somebody else finding out about it, reporting it to the FCPA. They have a whistleblower framework as well, and the whistleblower gets a share of the loot, if you like, or the disgorgement. So, there are a whole lot of reasons why companies need to understand exactly what's going on in their businesses and have the systems in place to stop it as soon as it's identified. Turning a blind eye is just not an option. But in terms, sorry, do you want to? Okay, just in terms of your actual question, we had a really good example late last year of one of our assets, which was actually shut down by a community protest for 2 or 3 days. It was losing a lot of money. Had about maybe 700 employees, and it was shut down for those few days by a very small number of a sector of the community. Within about 3 days, 7,000 people protested in support of that operation.
Right.
And they weren't protesting in support of that operation because of the taxes and royalties we paid to the capital city. They were protesting because they had seen over a very long period of time the benefits that asset had contributed locally through small business development, educational programs, the spin-off employment through the business development work. And on the basis of that very strong support, the project basically reopened the next day and has great strong local level support. So the criticality of getting that right.
But is that any hedge against the fact that you might be doing all that work on the ground, but what ought to be coming down, if we're measuring through the EITI, what goes in and what comes out, there's a whole bunch missing in the middle. Is that any hedge against that or not?
Look, I think it is a hedge in terms of that local level support because unfortunately the reality is we pay taxes and royalties to the host government and they decide how that money is spent. Now we try and encourage it to come back, at least a proportion of it, but they may well be doing great work with those taxes and royalties in other parts of the country to lift relatively poor areas out of poverty, build healthcare, education, etc. The local people will not understand that, they won't know that. So unless they see the local level support and benefit, they're just not interested in what gets paid.
So it's almost two separate conversations, except in the extreme example we heard from Jacqueline at the beginning, where it coalesces, completely in a completely ranked system. It's almost two separate conversations.
I think it is, and our view is we have to get both right. So we've got to work on that, overall transparency and elimination of corruption around the very large amounts of money that we pay to our host governments where that occurs. But we also have to get that local level community development and support right to insulate that project against external and other agendas.
I wanted to just go back to the comments about whistleblower protection and to comment generally about the responsibilities of governments, whether host or home governments, and in this case home governments, the Australian government, to contribute to developing an enabling environment. And given the discrepancy between Australia's current foreign bribery laws and those in the UK and the US, the previous Australian government was undertaking a review of Australia's current criminal code, putting into force the commitments under the the OECD Convention. There's been a slow process of that. We would like to see Australia adopt the UK model in order to contribute to creating a level playing field for the companies who are operating in many different environments. And an important part of that also, alongside that review, is current review that's being taken under the Corporations Act of private sector whistleblower protection. We would like to see the Australian government strengthen that, and I think many companies would join us who voluntarily have within their systems the whistleblower protection processes that are an important part of ensuring transparency of what payments are being made, what business processes are going on within companies and between companies and governments.
I'm tempted to ask you, are there environments where companies should just say we can't operate there, we can't be there, we shouldn't be there?
I think it does happen already, in terms of companies not being there to actually start in such an environment. I would be surprised for a company to go in. But I suppose business is business in terms of it's about risks. Do you know what is the risk? But I think if you've been there for a long time, then the question is, are you able to get out or not? But I just want to go back, as you said earlier, which was quite good. We don't have to answer the journalist's question. But,
this is terrible that this has taken hold in this way.
Having said that, I just gave a picture of one sector in Zimbabwe which is really bad. But I want to go back and generalize about corruption. And that corruption is not an African thing.
I'm from Sydney, I know.
That I was about to say that. Someone said the only difference with corruption in Sydney or elsewhere and corruption maybe in Africa is that at least the lights work in Sydney. And that's actually a very important thing, because with Africa there's situations which are so bad that when you then have corruption and you steal from that, it sounds worse. But yet corruption is relative. Corruption is corruption. So when you hear of stories coming out of the press that, Africa is corrupt, it's not true. It's not that Africa is more corrupt than other places. And that's a stereotype which we need to get rid of. But Africa has taken a lot of strides into reporting now about corruption. And because as democracy has set into Africa, lots of countries are now, growing their GDPs and actively being democratic. And one of the things which is happening is that corruption is now being reported in African countries, in South Africa, in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, as I speak. And so when that is reported, then the world thinks that Africa is corrupt. Yet no, we should actually be giving Africa a pat on the back for now being able to bring these issues to the table and do something about them.
Do you think that makes a difference? Do you think using the EITI framework, the company says this is how much goes in, the government says this is how much we received, maybe we get to the point that a provincial government says, well, a bit came here, and you hope that the bloodhounds in the civil society sniff their way down through and figure out where the money went. Do you have a hope that this is the ultimate example of Zimbabwe, do you have a hope that that process can change your country, really?
As I said, as I speak right now, there's a huge corruption profile on the table. But the funny thing is that it's coming from the very same party which is corrupt or perceived as for the past years. We are now hearing of public services like, for example, your Medibank chairman earning $2.6 million a year in Zimbabwe when that little company doesn't even make $500,000 a year. But it comes from the banks. We now hear it's actually quite horrific, and it's being now put into the media, which at one time people would have thought was one party focused, but that debate is there. And so there is something which is happening, and what is driving that is the economy, because no one can rig the economy, and it's really going into free fall. So as we look at an economy which is in free fall in Zimbabwe, it starts correcting itself.
So the context of that information is important. When people are ready to hear that information and act on it at home and abroad,
yes,
the context makes the difference.
Yes, and it's very important to have the structures which you talk about. But how do we get them to play into that environment? How do we get the two together, so that we can then move on?
Ellen, I should comment that TI Australia, which I'm a part, is part of a movement of 120 chapters of TI in countries around the world, including in Zimbabwe, and TI Zimbabwe is playing a very courageous role in terms of putting a light on some of the issues and risks of corruption that are taking place in Zimbabwe around the resource industry and in terms of access to services, including health and education and protection services of police and so on, exposure of those. So there's a courageous event, courageous actions that are being taking place in many countries that are very difficult. And TI will only operate where there's that opportunity that there is a space for a voice to be heard, and that people will be supported in exposing those realities.
I think it would be wrong to place too higher expectations on what EITI on its own can achieve, but it certainly is, in my view, a critical starting point. But the other element of the whole EITI process is the multi-stakeholder engagement framework that basically drives it. So civil society, corporations and government get together to build that framework and put it in place. And I think by getting that coalition of people committed to helping to fight corruption in a particular country is a great sort of starting point. Because often, a company will say, gosh, if I stop making these facilitation payments, some other company is going to come along and eat my lunch, and I'll lose that asset or that opportunity. But if all the key companies in that region start working together and say, none of us are going to make those payments, we're all going to live by the same standard, you can help to sort of level the playing field. So in Indonesia, for example, which has a very long history of facilitation payments, now banned under the UK legislation, and BHP Billiton banned them a few months before that legislation coming in. There's now 25 multinational corporations working with the Indonesian government to try and help improve the regulatory framework within Indonesia to make those payments illegal in country as well. So I think by working together in a tripartite sort of way, we can actually help to try and make a difference. But just expecting EITI to fix everything on its own is not going to work.
I should just follow that up and say the multi-stakeholder approaches are very important, and collective action is also important. And one of the opportunities that I'll have next Friday is with other civil society members is to sit with the G20 anti-corruption working group to explore what the agenda of that group might be. But coming out of that process, under the Russian presidency, the B20 has established what they call a collective action hub, based in the Basel Institute of Governance and the UN Global Compact, to work together to create such opportunities where companies can work together in solidarity to overcome a risk in situations such as we've been talking about.
I want to come to the audience now. You've all been very patient. You're looking slightly weary. Any questions from this panel? I have another dozen for them, but I'm conscious not to dominate. This gentleman here. Anybody else on this side of the room that I'm missing out? Go ahead. If you could say your name and where.
Thanks. Mark Gray from the Australian African Business Council. Firstly, I just want to say thank you to Cardno and their team for a great day. I haven't written this much notes in a conference for a long time. And secondly, I just want to talk a little bit about corruption. At the Australian African Business Council, we do quite a lot of engagement with businesses interested in doing business with African countries. And we've had Jacqueline as a guest quite a few times as part of that education and facilitation. And I think the standard thing we get used to saying to people, which is very much what Jacqueline opened with, is that it takes two to tango. But then you kind of, after a while, you get a bit tired of saying that because the audience looks at you and say, okay, so what are we the ones that are corrupt, or are we the special ones like BHP and Rio that have got enough billions of dollars to go away and do something? So, as a small company, I looked at this myself. As a South African born, living here for 28 years, I decided to go and do business in South Africa. And I tried to figure out, how am I going to do what BHP does in a country like South Africa? So I went down the path of what Ian mentioned. I found the whistleblowing company, organisation called Corruption Watch. And I decided to make them a customer by giving them a whistleblowing framework platform like you talk about. And 2 weeks ago they went live with the latest version of the annual report that includes numbers from TI and the way that South Africa now deals with corruption. So there is good news. There is good news about what countries are trying to do about corruption in Africa. And as a South African born, I was surprised by what I learned through that process. And I want to just share one thing, because I think it's useful. In the report, and you can all get it off the website, but there was a question that was asked in this last annual report that came out a fortnight ago. Who are our corruption fighters in South Africa? And I think the audience would be surprised when they hear the stat. The stat was that 90% of people that report corruption in South Africa are African. Of that 90%, they're in an age group of 50 to 59, 81% of that 90. And of them, 74% are men. And of them, about 63% are in government. So you ask yourself, when you look at numbers like that, it's, as a coloured South African born, I had no expectation that black people were doing all of the reporting. So I just want to share that and get some feedback from everyone.
It goes to the heart of what I was saying at the beginning, that, not in the beginning, in my second half, that it's not an African thing, it's actually a human thing. So once we start labeling it into, for Africa and overseas, we didn't get that. But I did say that Africans are not corrupt. And I hear the figures.
Thank you. My name is Dawood Jamal. I just want to give you an overview of Mozambique experience in terms of fighting corruption. So in terms of government, it has been since some 5 years that government of Mozambique created the cabinet against corruption that follows up all the cases corruption in the State Department. Apart from that, the government has committed a few years ago into the Executive Transparency Initiative. With consequence of that, Mozambique has been declared compliant to ITI in October 12. So, interestingly, Mozambique too, civil society organizations, NGOs are quite strong in Mozambique, and they actually are partners in some sense, but they also fight and bring out to the table all this corruption. Society, the government, and the mining industry, and some of these organizations, local organizations, they work with international organizations like Revenue Watch, for example. I must say also that media in Mozambique press is quite free, so the press itself helps the government and also denounces cases of corruption in the country, all involved in Mozambicans and foreign companies. So this is to say that we also face these problems, but we have done given some steps, important steps forward, fighting. I wouldn't say eliminating, but fighting against corruption. Thank you.
So, Ian, any comments there?
Maybe just a quick reaction on that. It's really great to hear. I'm very delighted to hear that Mozambique has reached that very important milestone. Mozambique is a very important country for BHP Billiton. We have the Mozal aluminium smelter there that you'd be very familiar with. And when we started to develop that project, I guess maybe around 15 years ago or so, corruption was a problem in Mozambique, but we, with the government, made it very clear that we'd have a zero tolerance approach to the development of that project, and if anything was held up in terms of getting materials into the country to build that smelter, the government would help us resolve that problem and make sure that corruption was stopped. And within a very short period of time, we found that the demands for payments just stopped. Everybody understood that they weren't going to get money out of the Mozal aluminium smelter. We just set that expectation, and soon people just stopped bothering us. So it is possible, and Mozambique has clearly come a very long way, and it's a great credit to all those in the administration there to get to that point of compliance with the EITI.
Anyone else on the panel want to reflect on that? I have another question.
Thanks very much. My name's Margaret Callan. I have a question for Greg. I noticed that you're a member of the multi-stakeholder group for the EITI pilot in Australia. Could you tell us a little bit what the obstacles might be to Australia signing up to EITI? Because we certainly have pushback, I recall, from Papua New Guinea, where Australian government was trying to encourage Papua New Guinea to sign up to EITI, and they said, well, you don't do it yourself, so I don't see why, that you've got any high moral ground here. So I know they're interested, but I've never really understood what the obstacles are to Australia signing up to EITI, so perhaps you can tell us about that.
Well, the EITI is a voluntary mechanism, and those countries that sign on choose to do that. The governments of countries choose to do that. We have, for a long time in civil society, and I think with companies as well, encouraged the Australian government, which has been financially supporting the EITI process by large commitments to the multi-donor trust fund that is managed by the World Bank to support and enable participating countries in the EITI to strengthen their internal governance systems and their mechanisms. And in the last couple of years, Australia has also been providing financial support to the EITI Secretariat. We've thought for a long time, as you reflected, Margaret, that Australia shouldn't just be could provide better leadership, not just by giving money, but as a resource-rich country also joining in the process. So that led to a commitment not to directly implement, but to undertake this pilot, and where Ian and I sit there with Serena and others who are part of the multi-stakeholder group. We're at the stage where we're preparing our report and recommendations to government. We're not sure how the government will respond, but certainly I think we've reached a stage where we want to affirm and encourage the Australian government to decide to fully implement the EITI. In doing that, they will join other G20 countries in the US, the UK, France, Italy, and Germany is also undertaking a pilot at this stage. So while for a long time Norway was the only developed country that was implementing the EITI, several others have joined, and the US has recently formally applied to be a candidate. The UK is close to doing that, as well as France and Italy, and as I said, Germany. One of the things that we want to do with the Anti-Corruption Working Group, which also the G20 leaders have endorsed the voluntary nature, but also the importance of the EITI in ensuring greater transparency and therefore preventing corruption, we want to encourage the G20 countries individually, because there are many resource-rich countries across the G20 who could equally do that. I understand there's some resistance from some of the emerging economies like South Africa and Brazil, but we think a further opportunity for Australia to implement would encourage further that the developed nations are prepared to commit to this, which are resource-rich as well. So no longer is it the North speaking to the South and telling them to implement it. We would demonstrate that we are fully committed to such a process to ensure the integrity of resource management, of exploitation of resources. One of the things that's complementary to that, of course, as Serena and others have mentioned this morning, are the mandatory disclosure principles that have been legislated in the US, Europe, and soon to be transposed into the European countries. The Canadians have made a commitment to do that. There are a number of countries that are introducing such a mechanism. This means there are a number of different standards that are emerging, potentially, that companies will be, who are reporting in different jurisdictions, will have to report differently. We'd like to encourage the G20 to facilitate a dialogue to ensure one global standard of a mechanism that will be complementary between home countries and host countries in terms of implementation of greater transparency about resource payments.
And just very quickly on that, Ian, we were saying before about Australia's legislation relative, bribery to the UK Bribery Act. Just quickly, do you see that as a loophole that Australia needs to deal with to toughen that legislation?
Yeah, look, I think we've say in relation to transparency and anti-corruption, we want a level playing field. We don't want unethical companies coming in, undercutting us, paying bribes and winning business at our expense. So a level playing field makes a lot of sense to us. In relation to Margaret's question, one of the things that keeps coming up in relation to implementation of EITI in Australia is what is the business case? What's the cost-benefit analysis? And that's really what the Australian government is going to be interested in. I agree with everything that Greg has said, and that's all going to be part of the business case that we put to the Australian government. The other side of it, though, is there a burning platform? Are there revenues that are being paid to the Australian government which are being stolen by government officials and misappropriated? And that's probably a pretty hard business case to build at the moment. So the pilot really suggested there was no lack of alignment between what the companies in the pilot were saying that they're paying and what the government departments are saying they're receiving. So we can't sort of go to the government and say, look, we've got a major problem here with money going missing in the Australian system. We need this transparency. But the leadership points that Greg mentioned, that's the strong business case for Australia getting on board with the EITI, in my view.
All right, I might volunteer Fergus here. I just wanted to tie in the beginning and the end of the conference, and we were talking offline, which I'm sure he appreciates me now speaking into a microphone, about the way in which, in terms of the work of the Walk Free Foundation, they very quietly behind the scenes offer to help companies kind of audit their supply chain. And I wonder whether there's anything in what you've learned about how to do that and companies' willingness to do that that might reflect finally for us on this conversation about corruption, that willingness to shine a torch.
Thanks. I think just from the conversations that I've been involved in with companies looking at the slavery perspective, I think by and large most of them fall into the category of not wanting to be, if you notify them of the risk of slavery in their supply chains, the last thing they want to do is be employing slave labour in their supply chains, and they take very swift action to try and deal with that. Of the handful that don't fall in that category, I think that there's sort of two concerns. And the first one is fear of what would happen if they do find confirmed cases of slavery in their supply chains for their reputation, their brand, and their share price. And the other category, which is an even smaller group, I think, is people that are actually aware that they're using slave labour and don't want to take action about that. And I think it's obviously very easy to deal with the first case is a very simple conversation about different measures that you can take, and there's some of them I talked about today. In the other categories, I think there's some of the mechanisms that we talk about here are very similar. Transparency International Index, an external independent report that shines a light onto these types of issues. So there's a project called the Enough Project, which ranks computer and cell phone companies in terms of their transparency in disclosing their supply chains for certain component parts of computer chips that have a high incidence or risk of slavery or conflict minerals in them. And in that scale you see a lot of companies are taking extra effort to try and defend themselves against that and take active measures to prevent the use of those components. So Intel is one example of a company that has gone a long way towards it's made extensive efforts to try and prevent any of its supply chain being using those components. So I think those external measures can be very helpful for the different. Well, I think there's a spectrum of cases that you're dealing with, and in cases where it is quite tricky, public external reports, I think, and the example of other companies that are going out on an edge and pushing out the limits of best practice, I think is a really good example for other companies.
Any final comments from the panel? Yeah, great, Joe. You could only agree on it.
Absolutely. So supply chain management is a huge issue for all companies, I guess. I think exposure to the sorts of issues that you're talking about are probably higher in some sectors than others. So the resources company that I work for is fairly well upstream. We don't have a lot of suppliers into our business that we then repackage and sell on to somebody else. But we're very acutely aware of the supply chain issues that you mentioned, and we have standards and requirements around due diligence and auditing of our suppliers. But I think, one of the things that is challenging is how far back upstream do you go? And, I'm sure by chasing these supply chains right back, anyone could get an unpleasant surprise. So it's something we need to continue to focus on and build our systems and processes to capture that.
And just to also comment that, again, TI is working on those issues and recognises the added risks that companies that are committed in working with smaller companies in the supply chain. And next week, the Anti-Corruption Working Group will be looking particularly at that particular issue, both in terms of companies but also supply chain and public procurement as well, both sides of the coin. So it's a real issue and one going forward that I think that is the next horizon in this, another horizon that we need to be working